Okay, so if it's okay for you, we're just going through the order that was on the program. So you will be the first, Rose, Paolo second, and Lyra the third. But just before to give you the floor, I just would like to summarize very quickly what were our discussions yesterday and this morning, just to explain why your perspective, from my point of view, is so important for us French legal scholars and French scholars more broadly. So the starting point of this conference was a discussion and discovery from my perspective of the discussion about what is to be a scholar activist in the context of constitutional law, and more precisely in the context of the global discussion about constitutional law. And it is from this starting point that I feel it was important to create a discussion, because in opposition to this scholar activist debate at the global level of scholarship in France, because of our epistemic tradition, usually we don't have any reflexivity about our political and engagement as scholars. So I think here the confrontation and the dialogue between an external perspective and the French domestic perspective about what it is to be a legal scholar and what we do as scholars when we study and discuss constitutional law is really important. Even if the discussion is not open in the field of law, it is in French academia, in sociology, political sciences, and it is the reason why the first day was dedicated to discussion with non-lawyers, non-legal scholars. And after the discussion we had this morning, the first panel that highlights that despite this epistemic tradition, we have activism in French legal scholarship. It's just that it is hidden behind a general discussion and general assumption to be positivists. I think now it's interesting to have a more constructivist perspective and a discussion with scholars that really engage with their perspective, their point of view, and discuss their engagement and the need to have a consciousness of this engagement. So I'm absolutely delighted to have with us today Rosalind Dixon. She is Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales, and she was before an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Law School, and she was also a visiting professor at the University of Chicago, Columbia Law School and Harvard Law School. She is also one of the past co-presidents of the International Society of Public Law, and I told yesterday some elements about the journal icon and the importance of this specific forum for the debate about Scholactivism. So she works on comparative constitutional law, constitutional design, and constitutional law and gender. And her last, one of her recent icon editor was about unsexing scholarship towards better citation and citizenship practices in global public law. And that created a parallel with one of our interventions this morning from a French perspective about what it is to be a feminist legal scholar in France. So today she's going to present us a paper entitled Feminism and Scholactivism, some tentative reflections. And I stop here and give you the floor, Rose. Thank you again to be here. It's a real pleasure.
Merci Marie, bonjour, bonsoir. It's absolutely a pleasure to be joining you. I wish I was doing so in person, but thank you for the opportunity to join online. It's a great pleasure to be hosted by such a wonderful group of French scholars, and I'd like to thank you, Marie, for all the work you have done in putting together aspects of this program, including this panel. It's been a pleasure working with you in many respects, including in this one, and I'm delighted to be joining in conversation with Leora and Paolo, who I've learned so much from. Paolo has this wonderful new book, and Leora's work has informed my thinking for many years, so it's a true pleasure to be joining with them on this panel online, and I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts. So in some ways, if one is sitting in France or Australia, this whole idea of Scholactivism is a very foreign term. It's a made-up term, but it's also a foreign one that doesn't have intuitive kind of meaning. But I started to reflect on it because Tarun Kaitan wrote this very important piece on it, and in thinking about a forward on feminism, it was something I thought through quite hard and talked to Marcella Pietro Ridolfi and Ronya Duboka as co-authors about. Can I just check, Marie, that all of the slides and audio are working well at that end?
Yeah, we can see perfectly the slides and hear you absolutely perfectly.
Perfect. So the slide here really tries to give you a definition of what Tarun suggests Scholactivism entails, which is, his definition is that it is scholarship driven by a motivation to directly pursue specific material outcomes that are more than merely discursive. And he has two arguments. One is that this is intrinsically contrary to the role morality of a scholar, and the second is that it can be damaging to a cause. So if one is a democratic progressive or a social democrat or a feminist or a conservative, that being so driven by those motivations in pursuing scholarship is not only contrary to role morality, but potentially damaging to your cause. And what I'm going to argue is essentially that there is some value to this provocation, but that ultimately I'm quite cautious about us endorsing it and embracing it. One of the things for feminists is that it's extremely important to start with the understanding that when one does scholarship, there is no neutral point of view. This position is one that would be common to critical theory or critical race theory, but less common in the continental tradition or even in the French legal academy, to surface this so directly, to really remind us that there is no neutral position, and that the assumption of neutrality or objectivity often embodies long-standing assumptions and practices that embody power, and often male power, in ways that should be and must be criticised, following scholars such as Catherine McKinnon. The other argument that feminism makes is that to suppress perspective is in many ways to do violence to our lived experience as scholars. So we all bring to our work a certain set of experiences and perspectives, and that to deny that as shaping our work is not only to, if you like, hide part of who we are, it may be indeed to do violence to our own sense of self and our identity. The third claim that feminist scholars could make in relation to the Scholactivism critique is that it takes too sharp a distinction between the personal and the political, or between the academic and the personal. One of the things that I think is important to stress, which is not something we talk about necessarily very openly as scholars, is that we are all driven by a concern about career, about livelihood, about making a difference to our students. But many people are also drawn into the academy because of passions, some of which are positive passions and others of which are a source of anger, and being moved by injustice and the desire to try and create greater justice. I think that that motivation is an extremely powerful one, but also one that is very productive often for energy, willingness to really work really hard and to keep producing ideas and arguments in ways that are productive. Certainly, one of the things that a feminist perspective would bring is to say that the personal is political not only inevitably, but in ways that can be a source of activist progress to recognise and understand and embrace. The fourth argument against the Scholactivism position or critique of Kaitan is that backlash is not always negative. It can be. And in my recent book, Responsive Judicial Review, I have discussed with some of the French scholars in the room some of the ideas and the difficulties for courts as institutions in rendering decisions that might produce very severe and damaging forms of backlash against courts as institutions. But backlash can be necessary for social progress as a cost of that progress. In some cases, it may even be generative. It can produce movements and counter-movements that help stabilise new meanings, that embed constitutional ideas in public debate and discourse, and that stabilise in new ways, different ways of being and regulating our social lives. I'm not sure I would go as far as CERCCLE and Bob Post in their important work on abortion politics in the US in saying that backlash is to be embraced, but I would certainly say that it has some benefits as well as costs for legitimate democratic change. One of the things I think is important is to hear what is useful in the Scholactivism critique while rejecting it as an absolute position. So one of the things that means is seeing Scholactivism as a question of degree rather than kind, seeing ourselves as all motivated by ideas, perspectives, passions, commitments, but still seeking to temper the role that they may play in certain ways and in certain contexts. So the first question that we ask ourselves in assessing the degree to which work meets the scholactivist versus scholarly description is to ask whether it follows established academic traditions of engagement with evidence and counter-argument, and that is a crucial dimension of good scholarship and legitimate scholarship, and that I think that far more than motive is the most important test of whether scholarship helps advance knowledge. And here we see really the distinction is between good and less good scholarship, not between scholactivist and neutral or non-political scholarship. One of the other arguments that Tarun makes is that scholactivism is often rushed, that it is produced under conditions of a sense of felt moral urgency in ways that shortcut scholarly norms and processes. That seems to me a helpful indicative criterion of whether things are good or bad scholarship, and that often rushing is a sign that scholarship is produced in ways that are problematic. But it is again a presumption and a question of degree. Sometimes there are legal issues that require an urgent response. One of my most favourite ever engagements in public debate from a scholarly and activist perspective was an op-ed I co-wrote with my longtime and frequent co-author David Landau around the events of January 6th. We had the great advantage of one of us being in Sydney and a time advantage, so that we wrote the first piece in the New York Times calling for the removal and impeachment of Trump following the events of January 6th. There was no waiting to do that better. We certainly did everything we could, and the New York Times was amazing in what they required of us in the evidence and engagement with argument in that time frame. But the urgency required an urgent response, and I think we need an exception for urgent circumstances to defend constitutional values and norms that does not treat temporal speed by itself as an indication of problematic work by scholars. The third criterion I would suggest in judging these questions of degree is the kind of work we're doing. Is it an op-ed? Is it a guest editorial? Is it an opinion piece of some kind? In which case we should be more open to very clear political and non-discursive motivations. The more something cues to the tradition of an ordinary article, the more we would expect it to conform to ordinary norms of taking one's time, deliberation, evidence, counter-argument, and less overt sense of responding to a single political moment or event. But perhaps the fourth and most important criteria for judging the degree to which scholarship is problematic along some Scholactivist dimension is the degree to which it acknowledges positionality and motivation in an open way, and therefore opens itself up to debate, critique, counter-argument and scholarly exchange on the terms in which it is offered. Indeed, a very real concern with the Scholactivist critique is that it doesn't eliminate political personal motivation, it simply drives it underground in ways that are distinctly counterproductive to rigorous and useful scholarly exchange. We know that often transparency in argument produces better argument, and the same could be said for our positionality as both our own experience and where we are coming from, but also our motivations in a particular project. So reflecting and stepping back then, for me, the value of talking about Scholactivism in the terms in which Turun Kaitan does, which is deeply critically, is to remind us of the importance of methodological rigour in our work, regardless of what moves us. Good scholarship is considered, it is reflexive, it is always driven by a desire to ask hard questions about what we have done right and what we have done wrong and how we can do better. And it is evidence-based insofar as evidence is relevant to the appropriate genre or subfield, and it is always argument-based. It is committed to dialogue with peers and peers' arguments, and taking seriously the arguments of both those who are sympathetic to our position and critical of it. It means seeking peer feedback, whether through peer review or informal feedback or both, of our arguments and seeking to revise and improve them in light of that kind of discursive process of exchange. To me, that kind of process is the definition of good scholarship, and it is also what distinguishes dangerous from welcome forms of passion and motivationally inflected work, the good and the bad version of it. I also think that we learn from it that there is value to being as open as possible about our positionality, both in terms of experience and motivation. I think we also, in the current moment, particularly the moment where so many faculties around the world are being confronted with conflict around the ongoing war in Gaza, that we have to be aware of what the position that we take as scholars having potential spillover effects on the credibility of our institution, of institutions such as universities more generally, and on our students' sense of being able to safely learn. These are very difficult questions because academic freedom, which Laura writes and thinks about very deeply, and others in the room as well, requires us to be able as scholars to pursue, in my view, in a fairly Scholactivist manner, our ideas, passions, pursuits and positions. But we do need to be mindful that we are teachers as well as researchers, and that methodological rigour may be a necessary but not sufficient condition in certain circumstances for ensuring that we are good and safe teachers. But ultimately, you will see that drawing on my own work in a variety of contexts and my commitment as a feminist, I cannot embrace too strongly the version of the critique that Turun Kaitan offers, which is the version that suggests that some sort of clean separation between scholarship and motivation is possible. Indeed, I think it is almost impossible, largely undesirable, and prone to drive motivation underground rather than to drive it away. So I think having these discussions is deeply important and productive. It encourages methodological rigour and transparency, but a full embrace of this language and critique, I think, is mistaken and could take us down a mistaken path. So I will stop there, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Paolo and Laura and to the discussion.